Welcome to the third part of Momentum, the third session. This is the session on distribution. So we've basically at number 4 now. So we've had our first session, which was the introduction of momentum, explained a bunch of the underlying concepts, the thinking behind it, the sort of cultural pillars, ways of working, what it's trying to achieve. We had acceleration and coherence, where we worked out and we looked at how we provide a rapid, robust answer that is logical, sequential, and can be endorsed by senior executives. Session 2, which was our third video, was around translation. So that was around how you create action out of an answer and how you make sure that all the nuance of the answer isn't lost in the translation, and you make sure that everybody who's involved is very clear on what the motivations are of the answer, what the problem is, and what success looks like. So now we get to the final point, which is distribution. To recap again, Momentum is a planning framework. It's focused on solving problems, and it's been developed to help marketers, media, and advertising leaders make better decisions. And additionally, it's been designed to help you get support for decisions and build a strong case for endorsement. So your thinking, your ideas, all this work is in a position that it can be signed off and can enter the real world. And lastly, it's focused on delivering better commercial outcomes. It's inherently rooted in helping businesses sell more things, and it's very focused on delivery of that commercial goal. Session 3 rundown. Distribution is ultimately focused on delivering the answer and solving the problem. So if you think about the stages that we've gone through, identifying a problem, creating directional answers, creating more refined answers, turning those answers and translating them into action, now you're at a point where you would be delivering on the problem, or on the answer, sorry. So the key, in my view, to making sure that you have the best chance of high effective delivery is all about consciously going back to the problem consistently as the answer is being delivered. I think if you lose track of what that problem is and what you're trying to solve for, when that answer is in the process of being delivered, and there's all these different moving parts, and there's inherently probably other things you're doing at the same time, if you lose track, you lose focus on that, you can start to get a little bit disconnected from why you're doing it. So it's really all about sort of purposeful delivery. So in that sense, this session really isn't about, here you go, here's 7 different ways in terms of how to deliver on a product or on a solution. Every time that's going to differ. It's about sort of steps that everybody can take along the way in delivery to make sure that you never lose sight of that. So the focus is really on the delivery of the management systems that we outlined. Remember in session 2, in translation, we looked at management systems that were developed as a result of the pre-mortem. So we looked at all the different things that could happen, and we decided that we would come up with a whole bunch of initiatives that ensured that they had the lowest chance of occurring. You're going to come back to that consistently, because that is built to be done during the distribution process. The second part of the focus on this session is generating confidence and momentum from the client as the activity becomes active. So ultimately, you're still in the business of managing the expectations of the client. And there's sort of 2 clients in this sense. There's sort of the direct client who's commissioned the work, but then there's all the people that they also need to make sure that they're managing up to. And people in that business making sure that they feel really confident and they've got full visibility on what's being delivered, and they're getting pretty transparent, pretty honest reporting. So that momentum and that confidence, that's important. One, to sort of keep you focused on delivering on the answer. The second one is to get that sort of incremental benefit next time a problem occurs, and they can look back on the delivery that you've done on this one and think, well, that worked really well. I feel really confident in trusting that partner over there, and I'm going to give them this new problem to solve. And if you think about professional services, you think about any sort of consulting or any sort of marketing, advertising, marcoms consulting, it's all about developing that credibility, that trust. That becomes repeat business, and you start to generate really good long-term relationships with client partners, which I think is kind of absolutely the backbone of the business. The last part is around keeping reporting purposeful and aligned to the key elements of what the problem was. Reporting can blow out. It can turn into sort of reporting on everything because there's generally no shortage of data. But ultimately, I think the real interest, the real kind of captive interest in what you're doing is rooted in solving the problem that was there. So the closer you can get to reporting only on that, and then providing information on other inputs to that, if it's asked for, is much better than doing it the other way and reporting fundamentally on inputs, then sort of dancing around the core output that they want. Then you'll start to get a frustrated client who's saying, look, I get all this, but can you just give me an understanding of how this is going in relation to the one thing that I'm probably judged on? Like I said, the specific mechanics of distribution will be different depending on the problem, but I think the right systems in place are important. Communicating progress is super important, and always thinking about why you're doing something, how it relates to the answer and how it solves the problem, even right to the end, even after the activity has finished, is a universal way of operating that I think is super important. If we look at the process map on distribution, we've got our sort of setup of activity, we've got our launch, we've got our launch briefing, and we've got our executive comms. Reporting for, say, a brand manager or a marketing director, you can choose to report however you want. The briefing reporting and the executive comms are all super, super concise. I will warn you, visually they're not amazingly appealing, and if it was me and I was speaking to a client, I'd probably refine these in a way, or I might make them a dashboard or something like that. But you can see how I've tried to be as reductive as possible, only communicating the key elements. And I think that's a really good way to do something, rather than, again, try and do too much, run the risk of boring the audience, and run the risk that when you send reports through every week, they're never read because they're too big, too much information, can't make sense of it. And whether I read it or not doesn't really matter, because I don't come out of it any more informed or with more insight. So less can be a lot more in this instance. If we go back to the pre-mortem, I think this is a really great example of management systems that will come through in the distribution phase. And you can see here, if I highlight these, you've got logistics set up. These are things that are going to be happening throughout the campaign, reviewing, landing pages, checking imagery, speaking to media partners. You've got delivery, so you've got things like that first 24-hour report. Really important. Most people hate doing this, but it's one of the most read things to make sure that something's actually happened as you want it to happen. Then you've got your first 72-hour report, making sure that things are pacing as per. So everything's kind of delivering in that just little first test of time. Is the hypothesis holding? Is the plan holding? Your week one report, and then you're sharing the above with key stakeholders. So making sure that these reports are merchandised properly. If you look at measurement, there's things that you're going to be checking along the way, mapping all events and stages, then making sure that when you verify against the map, those things are being tracked as events. Your 24-hour tracking to make sure that your conversions are looking right. Your 72-hour tracking to make sure that it's actually consistently delivering along. Performance oversight as well, 72-hour reporting, commencement to completion ratio in this example was really important. So that's another key element that you would be managing to in the distribution phase. And then hearing communication is super key, and that's going to be the focus of the rest of this session, which is a pretty short session. But generating that one-page summary within 48 hours. The reason for that in terms of distribution, super critical. Right up front, we identified that there was a need. There was an active CEO, and there was a peer group that wanted to be informed. There's a need for 4 to 6 weeks. So the view that I would take in this is, okay, if there's an urgency around the first 4 to 6 weeks, I can do a lot in that first 48 hours to show and generate confidence that I'm on top of it and my team's on top of it. Truncating that weekly reporting into a single page exec summary for the CEO. The CEO is active. We know he's active. The last thing that we're going to expect him or her to do is to read through 10 pages of reporting or log in to a dashboard and get permissions. There's ways that you can deliver just really good, concise reporting. So in a minute or two, she can read that report and be really clear and confident. One thing here that I put in, but I think it's important, is steercos are obviously a big part of momentum overall. When things are in distribution phase, when they're delivering, you're going to continue doing steercos. But a lot of the time, people who really need to action stuff in steercos can't attend a steerco, and some of those things can get lost. So I think making sure that you're documenting the discussions and documenting who's responsible means that you don't get I didn't realize I needed to do that, and you lose that time. You can't do steercos every single day. You might do them once a week, maybe twice a week if you're lucky. And you really can't afford for things to slip through the cracks, especially, again, using this example where there's a lot of eyes on it. And if something doesn't deliver, saying that, again, that first 4 to 6 weeks, it creates a lot of pressure downstream on the goal. So I think having that as a sort of communication mandatory is super important. Again, the documentation is just good practice. It's just good governance. So that's, again, if you're thinking about sort of examples of distribution, just staying on top of things as a collective is really important. Another thing this does, if you're the kind of person who's tasked with managing the client, or you're not tasked with managing the client, but you're a trusted advisor of the client, is if you're privy to all this, which you generally would be, questions can come through and you can avoid the dreaded, I don't know, let me come back to you, I need to speak to blah, because I don't really handle that area. And I think if you think about all the moving parts of this campaign, you've got media parts, you've got digital parts, you've got creative parts, you've got web experience parts, you've got conversion parts, you've got a whole bunch of different things. You don't want to be the person who's really being looked at to have the quick answer and not be able to answer it because, it's not the area I'm a specialist in. So this allows that everyone to have a pretty good understanding. Doesn't mean you can't go and get more in-depth information from someone in the group, but it does mean that you are equipped to probably answer the question. This is something consultancies do really well. They have very strongly informed groups that can generally answer whatever question is put in front of them. And they do a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure that they're not in a position of sort of handing something over and saying, well, go speak to X and then CCing X on that. That can look like a sort of avoidance of management and responsibility. Going back to the pre-mortem theming, there was 2 elements that we really knew were critical, which was around this executive peer group and CEO executive concerns in the first 4 to 6 weeks. So in terms of reporting, what I'd say is this is a key part to manage in terms of making sure that the results and the progress that you're making are distributed to the right people. So that's another sort of reason for the word distribution. Is that distribution is not all about delivery. You're managing different stakeholders. We sort of manage a customer stakeholder as well. But we're also trying to manage an executive stakeholder because this is critical for not only the business, but for fictionally the advisory's role in working on the business moving forward, and also the client's credibility internally. So really paying attention to this and managing to this cohort is super, super critical. And this is often forgotten in terms of thinking that this is an audience we always covet the approval of, and we always covet them to understand the contributions of marketing activity. But very rarely do we, as, say, marketing partners, do things that change the way we want to report and change the way that we communicate to adapt to them specifically. And so a big part of momentum, if you think about framing the answer, is how you frame the answer for a senior person to make an approval decision, for a senior person to understand logically and sequentially how you got to that point. So that's the kind of currency, that's the language that they speak. And it's all about trying to adapt the way that we communicate with them to that. It doesn't mean that we have to always think in that way, but when we're communicating an answer and communicating a great idea and rationalizing a great idea, we probably do need to shift that thinking, because the way that we speak to each other, for instance, may not work. It may not resonate with that group, and they may disconnect, and then therefore it's very difficult for us to have that influence. So what I've done here is provide a really basic example of what I would do to illustrate and share a launch with a broad executive group. So let's say in this sort of fictional B2B co, we're dealing with marketing leadership. They're aware of the specific details. They may report into a sort of divisional head, and they haven't really been involved, but they've probably signed the budget off, and they're probably as accountable to the outcome. And then they might report to the CEO we spoke about before. So we've got to consider her as well. So a launch briefing is basically saying, hey, we've launched the activity. Here's a really sort of whistle-stop summary of what has gone live, what to expect over the next X amount of weeks, and what the goal is that we're looking for. That's really about it, right? I don't think you need to do more than that, because you don't need to retrospectively validate the strategy. It's been decided. You don't need to retrospectively go back and truncate every single activity. Again, those things have been endorsed, they've been signed off. So there's no point having to sort of re-prosecute the case. I think it's much more around, okay, this is what we're doing, this is when we're doing it, and this is why we're doing it. So the why is super important. The why is the customer acquisition goal. Really clear, it's 20,000. The customer revenue goal, I think, makes it real. It turns it from just a sort of figure into a dollar figure. And then people can look at that and say, okay, that's a meaningful amount. The way that I got that was looking at year one revenue in. So I'm not going to know with, say, B2B Co, that the average person sticks around for 7 years, for instance. So the specific ARPU I'm not familiar with. But I can look at year one ARPU, which is the trial period times 3 plus the normal price for 9 months. That gives me a 12-month number. I can back GST out if I want to be really tricky and just look at the straight excluding GST number. But effectively what it sort of suggests is, hey, if I spend X dollars and I can generate this 20,000, that's $5.88 million of incremental sales volume for year one, just generated in this campaign period. I think it's just important so people go, oh, okay, I get that. And then they're probably thinking about their target, so they can start to see in terms of the bigger game, the macro game, how important this is to deliver on their numbers for the quarter. The summary media schedule is basically looking at week along the way. So I've done 15 weeks here to sort of summarize it because to be perfectly honest, I couldn't fit in more into the table. And I've just got my channels individually linked. So the green says when they're going to go live. But basically, again, if I'm the CEO, I can say, oh, we're on YouTube basically every week. We can expect some out of home in weeks 5 to 8. And then I'll probably see some billboards on the way home in these times here. So you start to get an understanding of when everything's running. I don't need to put investment numbers. I don't think they really care about that. I think they just sort of care about, all right, like there's some stuff running. They could ask some questions. Okay, like what audio are we doing? Are there any specific sites we're looking at for out of home? Podcasts. I listen to podcasts. Well, which ones? Do we have any, or is it more of a run of network type thing? So it just gives an example of what's happening, so they just know what to expect. I think the last thing you want is like, oh, we've got $4 million worth of media running, and they're like, where? And it's like, oh, they don't know. So this is just a way of saying, look, we've kind of bought all this stuff. This is generally what it is. If you've got any questions about it, more than happy to go into more depth, but it's probably going to be sufficient. And then in the messaging by channel, what I would suggest here is just put some examples of what's actually gone live. So you can say, well, already, 24 hours in, these are some examples. We've got these Instagram posts running. Here's an example of the out of home on the Pean Highway. Here's an example of out of home at 7-Eleven. If you click here, you can see the 15, you can see the 6, you can send it to your friends, you can send it to people in the company. It's just a way of sharing that information. And I think for a launch, that's enough. There's no point having 17 graphs in there. You're not going to know much about what the campaign's doing. You're just trying to summarize, hey, we're live. I've got it under control. Everything that we meant to go live is live. And we're really, really aware of the goal we need to hit. And we're not shirking it. It is the first thing you read, right? So that's, I think, a good launch briefing. You can pick your format. It's probably going to look better than this one, but I think the inclusions need to be the same. So then every week, hopefully someone's bought in, they're engaged on this. And then you've got your executive weekly briefings that can follow. So I haven't done the build on this slide correctly, so just let me go through it with this marker. But you have your campaign name, your reporting period sort of here and here. Right away, top left-hand side is how we're going with subscriptions. In terms of what I've got here is last 7 days and campaign to date here. Okay, so you can see exactly what's happened over, it's just an illustrative example. You can see what's happened over the last 7 days, and then you can look at cumulatively what's been happening in that time. Then I've looked at on the second part of the top, which is sign up commencement, which is the amount of people that have actually decided to start. So you can see like the number here is made up, obviously. But you can see here it's sort of roughly 30 to 40% convert. So you can see if you're an executive going, oh, okay. One of the questions I would probably have if I was CEO is, all right, like how many people are actually coming in and intending to buy, and then how many do buy? Are we easy enough to buy? If there's a big discrepancy between these two numbers, you would suggest that you're probably not as easy as you need to be. And then you can start to see also, all right, if volumes were down, what's driving it? So is it not enough people even coming in, or is it not enough people converting? It's just a clear way to get shorthand around sort of the super most effective parts of the conversion. These are better metrics, I think, than, what's the click-through rate, how many impressions got served. I probably don't know what to do with those. I don't know how to make them make sense in relation to, are we selling enough stuff? And again, like I've said multiple times in this process, Momentum's all about commercial outcomes. It's all about selling more things. So keep the language of reporting very purposeful to selling more stuff. Once you've established that and the person's clear on whether you're selling what you said you were supposed to sell, then you can go into other information as you go. The performance versus forecast, I think, is a nice ratio where you can say, hey, we're at 42% in terms of gap to goal or where we need to be. We're 6% ahead of where we thought we'd be at this point in time. So if there's a straight line between day 0 and day 100, we're at, say, day 36, but we're at 42%. So we're actually pacing ahead. So we're in a really good spot. Simple, clean, easy, can open up questions if they need to. If not, don't need to. I've got my active placements here last 7 days. That's an extension of, okay, what is running? Are we comfortable with what we're running? Are we running enough? Or, okay, we've got these things happening, blah, blah. I just need a summary. I don't need weights. I don't need volumes. They're not going to know what to do with that. Search volume, again, has been flagged in this instance as important. Would I put it in every single thing? I don't know. But then I can have call outs, say, here, and I can have interesting things. So really what you'd sort of say is, look, search is a really good example of how well this is going in terms of landing with people searching for B2B Co. Is it impacting searches for our competitors? I think branded search volume is one of the best examples of brand recall that there is, and it is a super important thing to put in. And then I have some key information here that's sort of more like dot points that are summarized. So headline with key points underneath. I'd keep the points to 3, no more than that. That's enough for an executive briefing. So you spend 1 hour on this. I think it's a pretty good hour you can spend per week on giving the really senior people in a business a really good understanding of what's happening. I think the marketing director will thank you because this is something they can send around really easily. If you do it in a format like this, it can be read on a mobile phone. It can be read waiting for a flight. It doesn't have to be something that becomes hard to access. So again, thinking about the audience, super, super important. So we've thought so much about the buyer and we've thought so much about what they do. We've also, as advisors, got to think about our buyer and the people that influence our buyer and making what we do very clear for them as well. Last part here, I think, is in dashboarding. So like I touched on earlier, you do get a lot of instances with reporting that you'll get just tons of like specific media things. So you'll get impressions by day or click-through rates or a whole bunch of sort of website event things that if someone just sort of came in, blind and just sort of saw all that, the question they would probably ask is, okay, well, what is this telling me? What does it actually mean? So dashboards are very much built for someone who's like on the tools, who needs to look at whether something's performing or not performing. And I think dashboards, probably the better job of a dashboard, because we've got tons of dashboards for delivery. The better job of a dashboard is a great executive dashboard where they can look and spend 30 seconds and say, everything's looking really great. So that's where we can take some learnings from other professional services who are really good at doing this, and making sure that there's sort of single views that can, one, minimize the amount of reporting work you need to do, especially reporting presentation work, and then secondly, increase the efficacy of that analysis in terms of how it relates to the audience. So single view prototype here. In terms of sizing, what I would probably do is make it so it fits really well on a 916 mobile. Again, people are probably looking at this in downtime or in between things. Making it desktop only probably minimizes the chance of someone actually being able to look at it. And then it's got to actually like kind of work on that format. It can't just sort of be something that's made for desktop, is a bit shit on mobile and is a bit broken. So I've tried to shape this in a way that would be quite nice on a mobile. Sales number, again, super, super key. Everywhere I've got these triangles is where someone can download if they want. So if you're on a desktop and you really want to get that top line subscription number by day, you just click that and get it to come through. Then we have a subscriber revenue number that's sitting there in terms of that ARPU that was calculated earlier. We've got top line subscriptions by day in a cumulative way. The reason why I would choose cumulative here is it gives you a good idea of whether things are tapering out or whether you're getting spikes or whatever else. So in this example, it's pretty smooth. So what you'd say is, okay, there's no signs that this is starting to ease off. But I think if you go on straight dailies, what you'll get is a pretty straight line. And you might get some things, but it doesn't tell you a story of how it's performing over the longer term. So I think that cumulative presentation is super important. We've got to focus on last 7 days here. So it helps understand the new numbers that have occurred since the last report. So here would be a cumulative across the entire campaign. And then this part here is around last 7 days. So right away, I'm like, okay, I know how many subscriptions we've got. I know what the revenue figure is like. I know what my top line subscriptions per day is, and I know how I've gone over the last 7 days in terms of commercials. That's more often than not, again, that relates specifically back to the problem and specifically back to the answer, which was all about the numbers. I've got some steps in process here in terms of, I think this would be interesting for almost everybody in terms of total visits to the site, feature page, startup, and then sign up, finish. And then we've got little numbers here where we can start to look at this over total last 7 days, last 1 day. It's good to be able to do this if you do make changes to see whether anything has improved. And it just can create like just quick default, click on this. Okay, I've got an understanding of how yesterday was. I can look at last 7 days. Are there any changes? Is there anything interesting? Then here I've got search volume and I've got search traffic, which relates back to that initial kind of risk and interest area, which was, are we going to do all this and drive awareness of all our competitors? So are we basically going to have more people thinking about B2B Co? They go into Google search B2B Co, a whole bunch of businesses conquest B2B Co, and so the volume and the traffic don't look the same. I think what happens is you ideally want those things to be consistent. So why not put it in the reporting? It's super critical. Now, we could argue there's maybe a whole bunch of other stuff that's important, but I've tried and stay away from media-specific things, i.e., we spent X or we spent Y. One is it's really difficult at a weekly phase to get an understanding of how much you've spent. Yes, you can do it on specific programmatic things, but it's quite difficult in this plan for things like out of home, things like radio, things like TV/video. So is it going to be accurate? Is it going to be meaningful? If you have those numbers up there, does it change anything? Does it lead to decisions being made? or changes being made that are going to be material, or is it just interesting for interesting's sake? And I think you're going to know how much you probably spent. If someone reads this and says, okay, looks like we're tracking ahead, have we spent more of the budget than we thought we would, you can just answer that question. But again, it comes from a position of wait till you're asked the question sometimes before you start to report on that. And often someone might say, this is more than enough reporting for me. I'm very comfortable where things are. Let's move on and talk about something else. So that's why I really like the idea in this distribution phase to have a light dashboard in terms of how you communicate it. And remember that the purpose of these 3 examples that I've given is to communicate it to a broad group. It's not about, here's a dashboard that allows me at any point in time to look and see whether I have to change a whole bunch of different things in relation to paid search bidding. Those things exist. You don't need me to talk about them. I think we already know them. So distribution ultimately is all about delivering on the answer and holding yourself to account in solving the problem. If you think about the 3 things or the 4 things we looked at these management systems, and we basically said, we believe there is a chance these things could potentially go wrong due to circumstances outside of our control. We need to mitigate the risk on that. Here's a whole bunch of things we're going to do to make sure that happens. We really know that this campaign has to deliver. It has to deliver in this certain time. Here's a bunch of things we're going to do to make sure that we get a really good view quite early on of whether that holds to be true. We're not going to fall into, she'll be right, we'll look at it in a week, it's too early. We've got a clear expectation, I think, of what is required. We have a really interested and active executive group who want information, but they're not going to sit there and trawl through every report that we do. So there's a bunch of, okay, your key focus as an executive is whether we are delivering on the problem of getting 20,000 more subscribers. That is really ultimately where the rubber meets the road in relation to the answer. So our reporting is going to absolutely focus on that to start with. And then we'll kind of sequentially or in a really logical way look at key drivers, but we'll stop at the drivers that become a little bit too detailed. If you want information on that, we can deliver it to you, but we're not going to start with too much information. We're going to start with as little as we think is required, and then we will add when we need to. And that is common if you think back to right at that first answer first. You do immerse, but you're not just immersing for immersion's sake. It's purposeful immersion. So you'll be looking at whatever information you think is going to help you crack a performance challenge once something gets into distribution. Another thing, don't be complacent and assume everything will go to plan. Management systems are important, and they're important for a reason because things so often don't. I think with reporting as well, resist the temptation to always report that everything is awesome. Or if everything's not awesome, then focus on something that you think is awesome as a way of trying to negate the fact that maybe the core thing. So if the core goal is not being achieved, but you say, but our click-through rates are 3 times the industry average, I don't know if they're going to care so much because it's irrelevant. You're still not hitting the number. So you're sort of trying to do a bit of a look over here. And it also means that I think you start to lose credibility because the person would be saying, well, we're talking about this thing that's really important to us, and they seem to be enamored with click-through rates, and that's not really that important. So focus on concise, important information, not merely interesting things. I think otherwise reports often don't get read. They just don't. And we're all guilty of it. And we all probably don't want people to think that people don't read our reports, but I just think in so many instances they don't. Because sometimes we care much more about what's inside than what they do. So there's a good way to flip it and say, well, we'll focus right on what you care about. I'll still be doing the things that I care about that are really important to deliver on this. But I'm not going to sort of use it. I'm not going to use reporting as a way to show you how busy I've been and show that I've been working really hard for you. Main reason for that is I think reporting loads of information will frustrate executives. I've felt this firsthand, and trust me, as someone who probably over-reported and overshared for years and years and years. Again, I think from a good place, a place of, hey, I want to show you like how much attention I'm paying, how diligent I'm being. that just get frustrated, and you start to not have the, oh wow, that person's paying a whole bunch of attention, they're really working hard for me. You'll get this, I don't really get what they're talking about, they're too verbose. Things that possibly don't reflect so well. So I think again, think about the audience and think about how much time they've likely got to give you. It's probably a couple of minutes, right, at best, and that's perfectly fine. You don't need more than that. So again, thinking about the process here to close, setting up and preparation, focus on the answer and what has to be delivered, and then mitigate foreseeable issues. So that's a really good way to prepare generally across all types of activity. Being aware of that, being cognizant of things that can possibly happen and go wrong, because we're always looking for the things that can go right, but sometimes the things that could go wrong are the things that sort of undo results and commercial outcomes. Launching with care is super important. I think that just that first kind of 48 hours, 72 hours is a really good opportunity to show, what you're doing, how much you've done, how proud you are of the campaign, but how committed you are to deliver the result. And again, if you think about momentum and you think about endorsement momentum, super important to concisely inform that audience, build their confidence, and this gradually build it over time. Sort of think of it sort of almost brick by brick, building upon that sort of that wall of confidence. Then if you think about executive comms to end with, I think tailoring them on results is key, and then the data and the context they need to make decisions. I think they're thinking and they're in decision-making mindsets. They're not in, that's interesting, wow, what a great session. They're in a, what do you need me to do? Are things running the way they're supposed to? If they're not, how am I going to manage this? If they are, okay, great. What are you going to do to manage it moving forward? And I think that executive buy-in can serve all of us really well in terms of, I guess, placing the right value on what we do and then making sure it's recognized. But I think the more it's recognized, the more value that gets placed on it, the more it enables us to have a greater seat at the table. And I think that's something that we all probably want. So that is it for session 3. And that is the conclusion of momentum in terms of these video instructionals. I hope you've enjoyed them. I've really enjoyed preparing them and also delivering them. If you've got any feedback, I'd love to hear it. But it's been a pleasure, and I hope it's been helpful. So have a great 2025 and beyond. Go well in solving problems. Go well in finding answers, and hopefully see you all soon. Thank you.